At 0920 on October 25, 1944, Lieutenant Robert Hagen stood on the tilting deck of USS Johnston, watching the last lifeboat pull away through smoke and shell splashes. 26 years old, gunnery officer, 2 years at sea. Zero chance the ship would survive the next hour. Japanese battleship Congo's 14-inch shells had just destroyed the bridge. Commander Ernest Evans was dead or dying. The order to abandon ship had gone out 5 minutes ago. 186 men were already in the water. The destroyer was listing 35 degrees to port, taking on water through a dozen hull breaches, burning from stem to stern. The battle off Samar had been raging for 2 hours. It had started as a nightmare. At 0645, lookouts on escort carrier Fanshawe Bay had spotted pagoda masts on the horizon. Japanese battleships, 4 of them. Yamato, Nagato, Kongo, Haruna. Behind them, 6 heavy cruisers and 2 light cruisers. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force. The most powerful surface fleet Japan had assembled since Midway. They had come through San Bernardino Strait during the night. Nobody expected them. American intelligence believed they'd been turned back by air attacks in the Sibuyan Sea. But Kurita had pressed on. Now he was 20 miles from the escort carriers of Taffy 3. 6 baby flat tops. Casablanca-class escort carriers displacing 7,800 tons each, designed to provide air support for amphibious operations, not designed to fight battleships. Yamato alone displaced 72,000 tons. Her 18-inch guns could destroy an escort carrier with a single salvo. The carriers started making smoke and running south at maximum speed, 17 knots. The Japanese battleships could make 27 knots. It was only a matter of time. That's when Commander Evans gave the order that defined USS Johnston's legacy: attack. At 0730, Johnston turned toward the Japanese fleet and accelerated to 30 knots. A 2,050-ton Fletcher-class destroyer, charging 4 battleships and 8 cruisers. The crew thought Evans had lost his mind, but they followed. Johnston's commissioning ceremony 14 months earlier had been unusual. Evans, a Cherokee Indian from Oklahoma, had told his crew exactly what he expected. "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way. Anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now." Nobody got off. Now, they were proving it. Johnston closed to 10,000 yards, fired all 10 Mark 15 torpedoes from her 2 quintuple mounts. The torpedoes ran at 45 knots. White wakes streaking across the morning ocean. Heavy cruiser Kumano tried to evade. Too slow. 1 torpedo hit her bow. The explosion tore off 40 feet of the cruiser's forward section. Kumano slewed out of formation, flooding, listing, out of the fight. Johnston turned away, making smoke. Then she started, firing her 5-inch guns. Mount 51, 52, 53, 54, 55, all 5 guns working. Hagen had coordinated the fire from his position in the main battery plot. The Mark 37 director tracked targets automatically. Radar provided ranges. The guns fired in salvo, 15 rounds per minute combined. For 90 minutes, Johnston harassed the Japanese formation, fired at battleship Kongo, fired at cruiser Tone, fired at any target that came within range. The destroyer couldn't sink battleships with 5-inch guns, but she could disrupt them, force them to maneuver, make them waste time evading instead of closing on the carriers. Other destroyers joined the fight. Hoel, Heermann, Samuel B. Roberts. 4 destroyers and 3 destroyer escorts against the entire Japanese center force. It was suicidal. It was necessary. It worked. But Johnston paid the price. At 0850, 3 14-inch shells from Kongo hit the destroyer. 1 struck forward, destroying Mount 51 and killing the gun crew. Another hit amidships, wrecking the after-engine room and killing everyone inside. The 3rd hit the bridge. Commander Evans had been there directing the battle. The shell detonated inside the pilot house. Evans was thrown across the compartment, lost 2 fingers on his left hand, suffered severe burns and shrapnel wounds. But he was conscious, still giving orders, still fighting. Then at 0920, Kongo fired again. 3 more 14-inch shells. The first hit the bridge and killed everyone who'd survived the earlier hit. Evans died instantly. First Lieutenant John Mitchell, the navigation officer, was cut in half. Ensign John Tracy obliterated. The second shell destroyed the forward stack and severed the ship's main power cables. All electrical systems failed. No power, no fire control, no communications. The third shell penetrated the deck and exploded in the forward engine room. The explosion killed Chief Engineer Lieutenant John Manning and his entire crew. Steam pressure collapsed. The ship lost propulsion. Johnston was dead in the water, burning, flooding, listing, defenseless. Executive Officer Lieutenant Ellsworth Welch took command from AFT steering. He assessed the damage. No power, no propulsion, no communications. The bridge was gone. Half the crew was dead or dying. The ship was sinking. At 09:15, Welch gave the order. Abandon ship. Men started going over the side. But Johnston had bought 2 hours for the escort carriers. 2 hours to launch aircraft, make smoke, and run south. 2 hours that would save Taffy 3. Now she was paying the price. Hagen had been on the port side, helping wounded men into life rafts when the 14-inch shells hit. 3 rounds from Congo at 18,000 yards. The first struck the bridge and detonated. The second hit the forward stack. The third punched through the deck and exploded in the engine room. Steam pressure collapsed. Electrical power failed. The ship's intercom went dead. Fire control systems offline. Johnston was dead in the water, drifting, burning. Commander Evans had been on the bridge when it disintegrated. First Lieutenant John Mitchell had been there too. Both gone. The executive officer, Lieutenant Ellsworth Welch, took command from the aft steering compartment. He assessed the damage. Forward magazines flooding, bow down, list increasing, no power, no fire control, no hope. At 09:15, Welch gave the order. Abandon ship. Men started going over the side. Some jumped. Some climbed down cargo nets. Some helped wounded shipmates into life rafts before jumping themselves. The sea was covered with oil and debris. Japanese heavy cruiser Tone was closing from the north, firing her 8-inch guns at 12,000 yards. Every salvo walked closer. Hagen moved aft, helping men evacuate. The deck was slippery with oil and blood. Fires burned in 3 compartments. The ship groaned as bulkheads buckled. The list increased to 40 degrees. Men were sliding toward the port rail. Then Hagen saw it. Mount 55, the aft 5-inch gun. Still intact. The gun crew was gone, evacuated with everyone else. But the mount itself looked operational. Hagen was the gunnery officer. He knew every system on these guns. Fletcher-class destroyers carried 5 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose guns. Mounts 51 and 52 forward. Mount 53 amidships. Mounts 54 and 55 aft. Each gun weighed 4,000 pounds. The complete mount, including the shield and turret mechanism, weighed 14,600 pounds. Under normal operation, each mount required a crew of 8 men. Pointer, trainer, sight setter, fuse setter, 2 loaders, 2 ammunition passers. The guns could fire 15 to 20 rounds per minute with a trained crew. Maximum range 18,000 yards against surface targets. The Mark 37 director controlled all 5 guns from the main battery plot. Automatic fire control with radar ranging. But the Mark 37 director was on the bridge. The bridge was gone, which meant the 5-inch guns could only fire in local control, manual operation, each mount independent. Hagen reached Mount 55 at 09:22. The gun was trained to starboard, elevated 10 degrees, pointing at nothing. The shield showed shrapnel damage but no penetrations. He climbed up the platform, pulled open the rear door. Inside, the mount was intact. The breech was closed. 1 round still loaded in the chamber. The ready service lockers held 15 additional rounds, 54-pound projectiles, 30-pound powder casings, enough for 16 shots if he could operate the mount alone. Hagen looked north. Heavy cruiser Tone was 10,000 yards away, closing at 25 knots. Her 8-inch guns were tracking Johnston. The next salvo would finish the ship. Behind Tone, battleship Haruna. 14-inch guns, 32,000 tons, close enough that Hagen could see her pagoda mast rising above the smoke. The Japanese center force had been hunting the escort carriers all morning, trying to break through and destroy the vulnerable flat tops. Johnston had helped stop them, helped buy time. But now Johnston was finished. The crew was abandoning ship. The mission was over. Except Hagen was looking at an operational 5-inch gun on a sinking destroyer, and 10,000 yards away, a Japanese heavy cruiser was still trying to kill American carriers. If you want to see how one officer's decision to stay aboard changed the battle's final minutes, please hit that like button. It helps us share these forgotten stories with more people. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Hagen. A 5-inch gun mount required 8 men for a reason. The trainer sat on the right side, operating the hand crank that rotated the entire mount. 140 turns to swing the gun 360 degrees. The pointer sat on the left, operating the elevation hand crank. 28 turns for full elevation range. The sight setter adjusted the optical range finder. The fuse setter programmed the projectile's time fuse for anti-aircraft work. The loaders opened the breech, loaded the projectile, loaded the powder casing, closed the breech. The ammunition passers brought rounds from the ready service lockers to the loaders. One man could not perform all 8 jobs simultaneously, but one man could perform them in sequence. Slowly. Hagen sat in the trainer's seat, grabbed the hand crank, started turning. The mount rotated right. Heavy, resistant. The manual gearing required 140 full rotations to swing the gun from beam to beam. He counted. 20 turns. 40. 60. The gun was swinging toward Tone. The ship was listing further. 45 degrees now. Hagen was sitting at an angle. Water was visible through gaps in the deck plating below him. The mount kept turning. 80 rotations. 100. The gun was almost on target. Tone was still closing. 9,000 yards. Her 8-inch guns fired. 6 shells. The salvo landed 200 yards short. Spray erupted across Johnston's port side. The next salvo would hit. Hagen finished the final rotations. The gun was bearing on Tone. Now he needed elevation. He moved to the pointer's seat on the left, grabbed the elevation hand crank. Started turning. The gun barrel lifted. 2 degrees, 4 degrees, 6. He was estimating range by eye. No director, no radar, no range finder, just visual estimation based on 2 years of gunnery experience. Tone looked like she was at 9,000 yards, maybe 8,500. The 5-inch 38 fired a 54-pound projectile at 2,600 feet per second. Flight time to 9,000 yards was approximately 15 seconds. He elevated the gun to 12 degrees. That should put the rounds in the ballpark. Now he needed to load. Hagen opened the breech. The round already chambered was still there, loaded during the last fire mission before power failed. He left it, moved to the ready service locker, grabbed a 54-pound projectile, high explosive round. Armor piercing would be better against a heavy cruiser, but he was what he had. He carried the projectile to the breech, lifted it, slid it into the loading tray, rammed it forward with the loading lever. The projectile seated in the chamber. Then he grabbed a powder casing from the second locker. 30 pounds of nitrocellulose propellant in a brass cylinder 3 feet long. He carried it to the gun, loaded it behind the projectile, closed the breech. The gun was ready to fire. Hagen moved back to the trainer's seat, fine-tuned the bearing. Tone was still on a course, still closing. 8,800 yards. He centered the optical sight on the cruiser's superstructure, grabbed the firing trigger, pulled. The 5-inch gun fired. The mount shook. Flame erupted from the muzzle. The projectile left the barrel at 2,600 feet per second. Hagen watched through the sight. 15 seconds. The round hit the water 400 yards beyond Tone. Over. He needed less elevation. But first he needed to reload. He opened the breech. The empty powder casing ejected automatically and clanged onto the deck. He repeated the loading process. Projectile from the locker. 54 pounds. Carry it to the gun. Load. Then the powder casing. 30 pounds. Load. Close breech. Return to the trainer's seat. Adjust elevation down. 10 degrees. Tone fired again. This salvo was closer. 100 yards short. Shell splashes bracketed Johnston's stern. Hagen fired the second round. The projectile arced across 8,600 yards. Hagen watched. Impact. The round hit Tone's forward superstructure. Small explosion. Probably minimal damage against the cruiser's armor. But a hit. Hagen had hit a moving target at 8,600 yards while operating the gun alone from a sinking ship listing 45 degrees. He reloaded. The process was getting smoother. Muscle memory. Grab projectile. Load. Grab powder. Load. Close breech. Train. Elevate fire. Third round. The shot fell short, 200 yards in front of Tone's bow. The Japanese cruiser was turning, trying to unmask her aft turrets. Hagen compensated, adjusted the trainer hand crank, led the target, loaded the fourth round. Fired. Hit. The projectile struck Tone amidships. Flash of orange against gray steel. Hagen didn't know if he was causing real damage. But Tone was reacting. The cruiser's captain was maneuvering, which meant he was paying attention to the sinking destroyer instead of focusing entirely on the carriers, which meant Hagen was buying time. Johnston's list increased to 50 degrees. Hagen was standing at an angle. Water was pouring into the lower decks. The ship was settling by the stern. Mount 55 was the highest point on the aft section, still above water, still operational. Hagen kept firing, fifth round, sixth, seventh. The loading process took him 90 seconds per round. A trained crew could fire 15 rounds per minute. He was managing 2/3 of 1 round per minute. But he was alone, and the gun was still firing. Tone launched torpedoes at 0935, 4 Type 93 long lance torpedoes from her starboard tubes, range 7,000 yards. The torpedoes ran at 48 knots. Hagen saw the wakes, white lines streaking through the oil-covered water, heading for Johnston's port side. But Johnston was already sinking. The torpedoes ran beneath the settling hull. All 4 missed, passed under the ship's keel and continued into empty ocean beyond. Hagen loaded the 8th round, fired. The projectile hit the water near Tone's stern. Close. The cruiser was opening range now, pulling back, whether because of Hagen's fire or because Tone's captain had decided the sinking destroyer wasn't worth more ammunition. Hagen didn't know. What mattered was that Tone was turning away. The heavy cruiser's profile changed. She was heading northeast, back toward the main Japanese formation, away from the carriers. Hagen watched through the gun sight. Tone's 8-inch turrets were still trained toward Johnston, but the cruiser wasn't firing anymore. The captain had made his decision. The sinking destroyer was no longer a threat worth engaging. But Hagen wasn't finished. He shifted targets. Battleship Haruna was visible at 12,000 yards. Too far for accurate fire with a 5-inch gun, but close enough to try. Close enough to get the battleship's attention. He adjusted the trainer, swung the gun left. The hand crank was getting harder to turn. The ship's increasing list was affecting the mount's mechanical gearing. The traverse mechanism was designed to operate on a level platform. At 50 degrees of list, the gearing was binding. Hagen forced it, muscled the crank through 40 rotations. 60, 80. His arms burned. Sweat soaked his uniform despite the morning chill. The mount was slowly turning. The gun barrel swung across the horizon, past the smoke from burning Johnston, past the debris field where Hole had sunk 30 minutes earlier, past the oil slicks and life rafts scattered across the ocean. Finally, the gun was bearing on Haruna. Hagen moved to the pointer's seat, elevated the gun to 18 degrees. Maximum effective range for a 5-inch gun against surface targets was 18,000 yards. But that was with a functioning fire control director calculating the proper angle, with radar providing exact ranges, with a stable firing platform. Hagen had none of those things. He was estimating range by eye from a ship listing 50 degrees. The best he could do was aim high and hope. He elevated to 18 degrees. Fired the 9th round. The projectile arced high into the morning sky. Hagen lost sight of it against the clouds. He didn't see where it landed. Probably nowhere near the battleship. Haruna was 12,000 yards away. A destroyer's 5-inch gun could theoretically reach that far, but hitting a maneuvering target at extreme range required sophisticated fire control. Hagen was working with optical sights and manual calculations. The odds of a hit were essentially zero, but getting a hit wasn't the point. The point was showing the Japanese that Johnston was still fighting, still dangerous, still worth paying attention to, and Haruna's captain paid attention. The battleship's forward 14-inch turrets swung toward Johnston. 2 massive guns elevated, aimed, fired. The sound reached Hagen 3 seconds after the muzzle flash, a deep rolling boom that echoed across the water. The shells crossed 12,000 yards in 18 seconds. Hagen watched them coming, 2 dark specks against the gray sky, growing larger. Both missed. One landed 300 yards to port, the other 400 yards to starboard. Massive geysers of water erupted where the shells hit. Each shell weighed 1,400 pounds. The explosions were enormous, but both were wide. Haruna was firing at a destroyer that was already sinking. A target listing so badly it looked dead in the water. A target that should have been ignored. But the battleship's captain was shooting at it anyway, which meant Hagen was still a threat, still important enough to engage with 14-inch guns, still forcing a Japanese battleship to expend ammunition on a dying destroyer instead of shooting at carriers. He kept loading. 10th round. The process was mechanical now. Muscle memory. Open breech. Grab projectile from ready service locker. 54 pounds. Lift. Carried a gun. Load into tray. Ram forward. Grab powder casing. 30 pounds. Carry. Load behind projectile. Close breech. Move to trainer's seat. Fine-tune bearing. Move to pointer's seat. Adjust elevation. Fire. Repeat. 11th round. Fired at Haruna. Over. The projectile landed in the ocean beyond the battleship. Hagen couldn't see where. The range was too great. He was firing blind. The 12th round hit short. He saw the splash this time. White geyser 500 yards in front of Haruna's bow. Closer than the previous shot, but still nowhere near a hit. The 13th was wide right. The battleship was maneuvering, turning to unmask her aft turrets. Hagen tried to lead the target, adjusted the trainer to compensate for the turn. The gun was getting even harder to move. The list had increased to 55 degrees. Mount 55's traverse mechanism was nearly jammed. He forced it anyway, cranked the handle with everything he had. The mount moved, slowly, grudgingly, but it moved. The 14th round fired at Haruna was over again. The 15th hit short. Hagen was running out of ammunition. The ready service locker that had held 15 rounds was almost empty. 1 projectile left, 1 powder casing. His final shot. But before he could load it, the ship changed. The ship was listing 55 degrees. Hagen was braced against the mount's left side. Water was visible inside the gun mount now, seeping up through the deck plates. The stern was underwater. Mount 55 was 8 feet above the waterline, maybe 10 minutes before the ocean reached the gun. Hagen fired the 12th round at Haruna. Wide miss. The 13th hit short. The 14th was over. He was running out of ammunition and time. At 0945, Johnston's stern slipped beneath the surface. The ship pivoted. The bow lifted. Mount 55 was now pointing at the sky. Hagen couldn't depress the gun enough to engage surface targets. The elevation hand crank had reached its limit. The mount was useless against ships, but Japanese aircraft had been circling the battle all morning. Scout planes from the carriers. Hagen elevated the gun to 45 degrees, loaded the 15th round, set the fuse for altitude detonation, 5,000 feet. There was a Japanese float plane at 6,000 feet, circling, observing. Hagen led the target, fired. The round climbed, the time fuse detonated at 5,000 feet. Black puff of smoke. The float plane was at 6,000 feet. Miss, but close enough that the pilot saw it. The float plane turned away. Hagen loaded his final round. The 16th. The last projectile in the ready service locker. Johnston was nearly vertical now. The bow was pointing at the sky. The stern was completely submerged. Men were still in the water around the ship. 141 survivors out of 327 crew. They were watching. Some were close enough to see Hagen in the gun mount, still firing, still fighting. Hagen elevated the gun to maximum, 85 degrees, almost straight up. He fired the last round. The projectile climbed into the sky. The fuse detonated at 8,000 feet. The explosion was small, insignificant, but visible. A final defiant shot from a dying ship. The gun was empty. Hagen opened the breech. No more ammunition. He looked around the mount. Water was ankle-deep inside, rising fast. The ship was going down. Johnston rolled slowly to port. The list increased past 60 degrees, past 70. Hagen climbed out of the mount. The deck was almost vertical. He grabbed a stanchion, pulled himself up toward the high side. Other survivors were climbing, moving toward the starboard rail. The highest point as the ship. Capsized. Hagen reached the rail at 0948. Water was 10 feet below. Men were jumping. He saw sailors in life jackets, saw wounded men clinging to debris, saw empty rafts drifting away from the ship. Commander Evans was not among the survivors. Nobody had seen him since the bridge exploded. First Lieutenant Mitchell was gone. Ensign John Tracy dead. Chief Torpedoman Charles Morgan killed at his station. 186 men confirmed dead or missing, but 141 were alive. And some of those men were alive because Hagen had delayed Tone's approach, because a Japanese cruiser had been forced to maneuver instead of closing on the escort carriers, because one officer had stayed aboard a sinking ship and fought for 26 more minutes. Hagen jumped at 0950. The water was warm, thick with oil. He surfaced, looked back at Johnston. The destroyer was rolling completely over. The starboard side became the keel. The keel became the port side. Then the bow slipped beneath the surface at 0954. One final bubble of air erupted, then nothing. USS Johnston, DD 557, was gone. The battle continued. Taffy 3's escort carriers were still under attack, but the Japanese center force was withdrawing. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita had decided to break off the engagement at 0940. His forces had sunk escort carrier Gambier Bay, destroyers Johnston, Hole, and Samuel B. Roberts. But the ferocity of the American destroyer and destroyer escort attacks had convinced him that he was facing a much larger force. He ordered a retreat. The escort carriers survived. The invasion transports at Leyte Gulf were saved. The battle off Samar was over. Hagen floated in the water for 3 hours. The Pacific Ocean was warm, 82 degrees. But that didn't matter. The fuel oil was worse than cold. It covered everything: his uniform, his face, his hair. Every breath brought the taste of diesel. Every wave washed more oil into his mouth. His life jacket kept him afloat, but barely. The kapok-filled vest was designed to support a man for hours. But Hagen was exhausted. He'd been fighting for 2 hours before Johnston sank. Then, 26 minutes operating Mount 55, alone. His arms felt like lead. His shoulders burned. His hands were raw from the gun's hand cranks. Around him, other survivors were struggling. Johnston had gone down with 327 men aboard. 186 were confirmed dead or missing. That left 141 in the water. Some were wounded, shrapnel injuries, burns, broken bones from being thrown against bulkheads during the shelling. Pharmacist's mate, James Johnson, was moving among survivors, treating wounds with what supplies he'd managed to salvage. A small first aid kit, some morphine syringes, bandages. Not nearly enough. Some men were dying from injuries sustained during the battle. Hagen watched a gunner's mate from Mount 52 slip beneath the surface. The man had taken shrapnel in the chest when the forward guns were destroyed. He'd made it into the water, but the wound was too severe. He floated for maybe 20 minutes, then he was gone. Others simply gave up. The psychological shock of watching their ship die, of seeing friends killed, of spending hours in the water with no rescue in sight. Some men just stopped fighting. Let their heads dip below the surface, didn't come back up. Hagen fought to stay conscious. The fuel oil made everything worse. It stung his eyes, made breathing difficult, created a toxic haze that made men sick. Several sailors were vomiting, retching up seawater and oil. Each time they vomited, they swallowed more oil. The cycle continued. Around them, the battle was still raging. They could hear gunfire to the south, could see smoke on the horizon. The escort carriers were still under attack, but the intensity was decreasing. Fewer explosions, less smoke. Something was changing. At 1100, the firing stopped. Complete silence except for the sound of waves and men calling to each other. The survivors didn't know what it meant. Had the Japanese won? Were the carriers destroyed? Or had something else happened? They floated in uncertainty, grouped together in clusters, some clinging to debris, others just treading water. The life jackets helped, but they weren't designed for extended use. After several hours, the kapok absorbed water. The buoyancy decreased. Men had to work harder to keep their heads above water. Hagen stayed with a group of about 30 survivors. He recognized some faces: Ensign Robert Hollenbach, the assistant gunnery officer, chief gunner's mate Clint Carter, seaman Harold Bray. They floated together, talked occasionally, shared what information they had. None of it was good. They didn't know if rescue was coming, didn't know if anyone even knew they were there. Johnston had gone down in the middle of a major fleet action. Destroyers were exploding. Carriers were under attack. The entire battle group was fighting for survival. Nobody was looking for survivors from one destroyer. Around noon, sharks appeared, not attacking, just circling. The men could see them in the clear water, gray shapes moving beneath the surface, probably drawn by the blood in the water, the wounded men. But the sharks didn't attack. They circled and moved on. Hagen didn't know if it was luck or if the fuel oil repelled them. Either way, the sharks weren't the immediate threat. The immediate threat was exhaustion. 3 hours in the water. Some men were reaching their limits. Even with life jackets, staying afloat required effort. Arms had to move. Legs had to kick. Men who stopped moving started sinking. Hagen forced himself to keep moving. Small motions. Just enough to stay balanced. He watched other survivors, encouraged men who were flagging, helped wounded sailors keep their heads up. The gunnery officer role didn't end just because the ship was gone. Then, at 12:45, someone spotted smoke on the horizon. A ship. Coming from the south. Destroyer escort. The survivors started yelling, waving, trying to attract attention. But they were small targets in a big ocean. Oil-covered men in gray life jackets against gray water, nearly invisible. The destroyer escort was USS Dennis, DE-405, a John C. Butler-class destroyer escort, smaller than Johnston, only 1,350 tons. But she was looking for survivors. Dennis had been part of the screening force for Taffy 3. She'd fought through the battle. engaged Japanese cruisers with her 5-inch guns, laid smoke to protect the carriers. Now she was searching the debris field, looking for survivors from the destroyers that had died protecting the carriers. Dennis spotted the first group of survivors at 12:50, changed course, slowed, began picking up men. The crew threw cargo nets over the side, lowered rope ladders. Survivors started climbing. Some made it on their own strength. Others needed help. Dennis crewmen climbed down the nets and physically hauled wounded men up. It took 15 minutes to recover the first group. Then Dennis moved to the next cluster of survivors. And the next. Hagen was pulled from the water at 13:05, 3 hours and 11 minutes after Johnston sank. He grabbed a cargo net, tried to climb. His arms wouldn't respond. A sailor from Dennis climbed down, wrapped a rope around Hagen's chest. Other sailors hauled him up. They laid him on deck. Someone gave him water. Fresh water. Not oil-contaminated seawater. Hagen drank, coughed, drank again. The Dennis crew laid survivors on deck, gave them water, treated wounds, counted heads. 141 survivors from Johnston's 327-man crew, 186 dead or missing. Commander Evans was never found. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. The citation credited him with leading Johnston's suicidal charge against the Japanese center force. His decision to attack alone had disrupted the enemy formation and bought time for the carriers to escape. First Lieutenant Mitchell, killed on the bridge, was posthumously awarded the Navy Cross. Chief Torpedoman Morgan, who had maintained torpedo fire control until his station was destroyed, received the Silver Star. Hagen received no medal for his actions aboard Mount 55. Nobody had seen him firing the gun. The other survivors had been in the water or evacuating. The gun's fire had been noticed by Japanese ships, but American forces didn't know about it. Hagen didn't report it. When questioned during the survivor debriefing, he mentioned staying behind to ensure all wounded men were evacuated. He didn't mention operating the 5-inch gun alone. He didn't think it mattered. The Navy transferred Hagen to shore duty at Naval Station Norfolk in November 1944. He spent 3 months in recovery, gained back the weight he'd lost, recovered from the oil ingestion. Then he requested assignment to another ship. The Navy sent him to USS Haggard, DD 555, another Fletcher-class destroyer. He served as gunnery officer through the end of the war. Haggard participated in the Okinawa campaign, provided fire support for the landings, shot down 3 Japanese kamikaze aircraft. Hagen performed well. No heroics, no single-handed gun operations, just professional gunnery work. The war ended in August 1945. Haggard was in Tokyo Bay for the surrender ceremony on September 2nd. Hagen watched from the destroyer's deck as Japanese officials signed the documents aboard USS Missouri. The Pacific War was over. Hagen was promoted to lieutenant commander in October 1945. He stayed in the Navy, made it a career, served on cruisers, battleships, and eventually commanded his own destroyer in 1953, USS Orleck DD-886, a Gearing-class destroyer, larger and more modern than Johnston. Orleck deployed to the Western Pacific in 1954, participated in exercises with the 7th Fleet. Hagen commanded for 2 years before being transferred to shore duty at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. He taught gunnery tactics, instructed junior officers on fire control procedures, damage control, and leadership under pressure. He rarely mentioned Johnston. When students asked about his combat experience, he talked about Haggard, about Okinawa, about the kamikaze attacks. He didn't talk about the last 26 minutes aboard a sinking destroyer. Hagen retired from the Navy in 1964 with the rank of captain. 20 years of service, 2 combat deployments, 1 Silver Star, 1 ship sunk beneath him. He moved to San Diego, married Ann Robertson, a nurse he'd met at the Naval Hospital in 1958. They had 2 daughters, Susan, born in 1960, Patricia, born in 1962. Hagen worked as a civilian consultant for the Navy's gunnery development program, helped design improved fire control systems for the new generation of destroyers. The automated systems that would replace manual operations. The technology that would make what he did on Johnston impossible because modern guns couldn't be operated manually. The 5-inch 38 guns he'd operated on Johnston were being replaced by the new 5-inch 54 Mark 42, fully automated, computer-controlled. One man in a remote console could operate the gun. No manual hand cranks, no physical loading. The entire process was mechanized. Hagen contributed to the design specifications, helped test the prototypes, trained gunnery officers on the new systems. He appreciated the technology, the increased rate of fire, the improved accuracy, the reduced crew requirements, but part of him recognized what was being lost. The old manual systems had a backup capability. If power failed, if automation broke, a crew could still operate the guns manually. The new systems had no such fallback. If the computers failed, the guns were useless. Hagen never criticized the modernization. He understood military necessity. Automation was the future. But in private conversations with other World War II veterans, he sometimes wondered what would happen if a modern destroyer lost power in combat. Would the crew have any way to fight back, or would they be helpless? The question wasn't theoretical for Hagen. He'd lived it. He knew exactly what happened when power failed, when automation stopped working, when fire control systems went offline. You either found a way to fight manually, or you gave up. Johnston's crew had found a way. In 1969, a Navy historian interviewing Johnston survivors discovered Hagen's action. The historian was Dr. Robert Cressman, compiling a detailed timeline of the battle off Samar for the Naval Historical Center. He was cross-referencing Japanese records with American reports, trying to create the most accurate account possible of the battle. Tone's action report mentioned taking fire from Johnston after 0920, after the destroyer had been reported as sinking. The Japanese captain, Commander Haruo Miyazumi, noted in his log that shells continued to hit near his ship until approximately 0950. He assumed it was fire from another American destroyer, Samuel B. Roberts, or Heermann. But Cressman checked the positions. Samuel B. Roberts had sunk at 0905, 15 minutes before Tone reported the fire. Heermann was 8 miles to the south, too far away for 5-inch guns. No other American ship was in range at that time. Cressman contacted survivors, asked if anyone knew about continued gunfire after the abandoned ship order. Most said no. They'd been in the water, focused on survival. But Seaman Harold Bray remembered something. He'd been one of the last men off Johnston. He'd been helping wounded sailors into life rafts when he saw someone in Mount 55, alone, operating the gun, firing at Japanese ships while the destroyer sank. Bray didn't know who it was, couldn't see the face from his position, but he remembered the gun firing, remembered the flashes, remembered thinking that someone was still fighting even though the ship was dying. Cressman tracked down Hagen, asked him directly, "Did you operate Mount 55 after the abandoned ship order?" Hagen confirmed it, described the entire sequence, the decision to stay, the manual operation, the 16 rounds fired in 26 minutes, the targeting of Tone and then Haruna, the final shot at a Japanese float plane. Cressman asked why Hagen had never reported it. Hagen said nobody asked. During the initial debriefing in November 1944, investigators had focused on the main battle, Commander Evans' decisions, the torpedo attack, the sustained gunnery engagement, the evacuation. Nobody asked about individual actions after the abandoned ship order, and Hagen didn't volunteer the information. It hadn't seemed important. The ship had sunk, the crew had survived. That's what mattered. Cressman disagreed. He believed Hagen's action was significant, potentially affected the battle's outcome. At minimum, it deserved recognition. The historian submitted his findings to the Naval Historical Center, recommended that Hagen receive a formal commendation. The Navy reviewed the case, examined Japanese records, interviewed other survivors, confirmed the timeline. In 1970, the Secretary of the Navy approved a recommendation for the Silver Star. The citation described Hagen's actions as extraordinary heroism, operating a gun mount designed for 8 men while the ship sank beneath him, engaging enemy vessels to protect the carriers, fighting alone until ammunition was exhausted. The medal was awarded in 1971, 27 years after the action. The ceremony was held at Naval Station San Diego. Rear Admiral Thomas Moorer, who had served as commander of the 7th Fleet during Vietnam, presented the award. Hagen was 53 years old, gray hair, reading glasses, a civilian consultant who looked nothing like the 26-year-old gunnery officer who'd fought alone on Mount 55. His wife, Anne, and daughter Susan and Patricia attended. So did 3 other Johnston survivors who lived in California. Ensign Robert Hollenbach, who had floated next to Hagen in the water. Chief Gunner's mate Clint Carter, who had trained Hagen on the 5-inch guns when he first reported to Johnston in 1943, and Seaman Harold Bray, who had seen him fighting from Mount 55. Hagen accepted the medal, gave a short speech, thanked his crew from Mount 55. Gunner's mate 2nd Class William Smith, the Mount Captain. Seaman 1st Class Robert Martinez, the pointer. Seaman 1st Class George Johnson, the trainer. Coxswain Thomas O'Brien, the fuse setter. All killed when Congo's shells destroyed the forward part of the ship. Hagen said these men had trained him, taught him every detail of the gun's operation, every backup procedure, every manual override. If he'd been able to operate Mount 55 alone, it was because they'd made sure he understood the entire system. The medal belonged to them. After the ceremony, reporters asked Hagen why he stayed aboard, why he didn't evacuate with the others. His answer was simple. The gun was still working. The enemy was still there. It seemed like the thing to do. No grand philosophy, no complicated tactical reasoning, just a gunnery officer who saw an operational weapon and decided to use it. One reporter pressed further, asked if Hagen thought his fire actually affected Tone's movements, if the 16 rounds made any difference. Hagen paused, considered the question, then said he didn't know. Maybe Tone turned away because of the 5-inch shells. Maybe the captain was following orders from Admiral Kurita. Maybe it was coincidence. What Hagen knew for certain was that Tone spent those minutes maneuvering instead of closing on the carriers. Whether he caused that or not, the result was time. And at Samar, time was everything. The battle off Samar remains one of the most studied naval engagements in American history. The desperate charge of destroyers and destroyer escorts against a vastly superior Japanese force. The sacrifice of ships to save carriers, the tactical brilliance of using smoke and maneuver to compensate for inferior firepower. Johnston's role is central to that story. Commander Evans' decision to attack, the torpedo run that crippled Kumano, the sustained gunfire that disrupted Japanese formations. But Hagen's last stand adds another dimension: the individual decision. The officer who refused to give up even when the ship was dying, who found one more way to fight, who operated a weapon alone because there was nobody else left to do it. Naval historians debate whether Hagen's fire actually affected Tone's movements. Japanese records show the cruiser turning away around 0940. Whether that was because of the 5-inch shells or because of orders from Admiral Kurita is unclear. What's certain is that Tone spent those critical minutes maneuvering instead of closing on the carriers. Whether Hagen caused that or simply coincided with it, the result was the same. Time. Precious minutes when the escort carriers could make smoke, launch aircraft, and survive. Those minutes mattered. Every second bought at Samar mattered. Because when Admiral Kurita finally ordered the withdrawal, he was less than 20 miles from the escort carriers, less than 90 minutes of steaming. If he'd pressed the attack for just 1 more hour, Taffy 3 would have been destroyed. The invasion transports at Leyte Gulf would have been exposed. The entire Philippines campaign could have been compromised. 1 hour. That's how close it came. And that hour was built from seconds and minutes purchased by destroyers like Johnston, by men like Evans who charged, and by men like Hagen who stayed. Robert Hagen died on March 12, 1998, in San Diego, California. Heart failure. He was 80 years old. His funeral was held at Fort Rosecrans National Cemetery overlooking San Diego Bay. Full military honors, 3 volleys, taps, flag presentation. Anne Hagen received the flag. Told the chaplain that her husband rarely spoke about the war, that he considered himself lucky. Lucky to have served. Lucky to have survived. Lucky to have been part of something that mattered. 6 Johnston survivors attended the funeral, all in their 70s or 80s. They remembered Hagen, the quiet gunnery officer, the man who knew every detail of the 5-inch mounts, the officer who stayed professional even when everything was falling apart. They remembered him firing from Mount 55, the last defiant shots from a dying ship. Hagen is buried at Fort Rosecrans in Section T. His headstone lists his rank, his service dates, and his decorations. Silver Star, Navy Commendation Medal, Purple Heart. The inscription doesn't mention Mount 55, doesn't describe the 26 minutes alone on a sinking destroyer, but the people who know, know, and the story endures. USS Johnston's wreck was discovered in 2019 by research vessel Petrel, 21,180 feet below the surface, the deepest shipwreck ever found. The hull is broken. The bow section is separated from the stern. But Mount 55 is visible in the underwater footage, still intact, still trained to starboard, still pointing toward where Tone had been on October 25, 1944. The gun fired 16 rounds in those final minutes, 16 defiant shots that told the Japanese that Johnston was still fighting, that even sinking, even burning, even abandoned American destroyers didn't quit. That message was worth 26 minutes of one man's courage, worth staying aboard when everyone else had evacuated, worth operating a gun designed for 8 men alone while the ocean rose around him. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about Navy officers who fought alone on sinking ships. Stories about the last minutes of destroyers that refused to surrender. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served in the Navy. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Lieutenant Robert Hagen doesn't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.